Are you paying attention? Maybe not to these nutrients. In today's episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast, we're going to be talking about some underappreciated nutrients. And Amy, maybe to start us off, dietitian in the house, can you give us some examples of nutrients that people already are very aware of and already appreciating and already talking about until they're blue in the face? Nutrients that will not be discussed in this particular episode because they're already very well loved?
Yeah, the ones that come to mind are like vitamin D. Man, that is the bee's knees these days. I find that most even PCPs run it on annual labs a lot of times now. So vitamin D is a big one. I think B12 is another big one. Iron we talk about. I don't know if it's necessarily super popular in the gut health space as much as it should be, but iron's definitely one that I think gets more attention. Zinc, magnesium, I think are biggies too that get more attention.
Folate, especially if you've been diagnosed with MTHFR. Dun, dun, dun.
Right. And some of those too, again, like those are all really important nutrients. So they should be getting they should be highlighted and glorified as well. But then there's also some other nutrients that are super important that I don't think get discussed and get a little lost in the sauce. And some of the ones I think we're going to talk about today, also people just tend to not get enough of in their diets. So, things like calcium we'll talk a little bit more about. Like calcium is one that my patients do not get enough of in their diet. But there's a number of nutrients I see as being low with many of my patients that are not super common nutrients that you hear a lot about.
And that's the dangerous combination, right? Like it would be one thing to say a lot of people don't care about this nutrient. However, nobody's deficient in it. Then it kind of wouldn't matter, right? But it's the combination of nobody is talking about or giving a shit about this nutrient, and also deficiency is very common. That's where you get this kind of squirrely stuff where people should be caring about some of these nutrients way more than they currently do. And that's why we wanted to do this episode.
Yeah, I think, too, it's so interesting. All the nutrients we talk about today have direct implications to the gut as well. So it's so imperative to be nourished, and not just nourished from a macro standpoint or that you're not eating processed foods, like these diet dogma type things. You actually need to be bona fide nourished from like a micronutrient standpoint too. And it's just not something that really gets discussed. Even the bigger, more famous vitamins and minerals that we mentioned, like most of the time the interventions are, take this B12 will solve all your problems. It's not necessarily, why don't you adjust your diet and get more B12, or adjust your diet and get more iron. Not saying supplements couldn't be useful, because I supplement with different things and I've had different patients supplement with iron. So it's like, I think that there has to be discussion around how to ensure nourishment long-term for people in general and in the IBS space in order to make progress.
Yeah. And that could be an episode topic for another day, by the way, is this idea of like, I'll just take a supplement and then I'm good and I don't need to worry about getting this nutrient from food. And one of the ones that we want to talk about today, vitamin E, is a really great example where that is probably not true. Like the thing that we slap in a bottle and call vitamin E is not the same compound vitamin E that you get in food. It's 1/8 of that complex that real vitamin E would be if you got it in like almonds, for example. Right. So, but that's maybe straying from the topic at hand a teeny bit, but that's something to start off with is, if you listen to this episode and the only thing popping into your brain is which supplements you're going to go order from Fullscript, that you're kind of missing the boat a little bit here.
Right.
But I want to start the episode strong with a nod to one of our friends that we actually had on the podcast about a year ago now. Sarah Ballantyne, and her book and her website, Nutrivore, are fantastic. She's really done a full 180, and she's gone from, encouraging a lot more dietary restriction with like the Paleo and AIP kind of world into what she calls Nutrivore, which is this crazy concept of trying to get your nutrients from food. What? And her Nutrivore book, she has this table on page 10 that I wanted to make mention of here. So she has a table, and it's the prevalence of nutrient insufficiencies. Now, that's not going to be the same as a deficiency. So it's a little bit, think of it as subclinical deficiency or deficiency, and you're rolling it all into one. But, based on some of the research in here that she cites in this book, to rattle off a few that we're going to talk about today, potassium. This study estimated that 97.8% of the population is deficient in potassium. So virtually you're guaranteed that this is an underappreciated nutrient that you would probably benefit from getting more of if you're listening to this right now. Vitamin E is right on the heels of that at 96.2%. And I'll confess, before we hit record on this episode, I was telling Amy that vitamin E is a nutrient that even I underappreciate. And I know for sure I undershoot vitamin E in my own diet. And it's been kind of lower on the totem pole. I have chosen to focus more of my effort on things like protein and iron and B vitamins, and I haven't yet paid much attention to vitamin E, but maybe I should. And then just to look at another one, calcium, this chart estimates that 54.9% of the population is deficient in calcium. And if you're avoiding dairy, as I know, like I did for 10 years, you're almost guaranteed to be undershooting on your calcium. And anyway, the list goes on. So there are other deficiencies that are really common. But again, I thought that this was a good way to start the episode so that people realize, yes, this does pertain to you. Yes, you should look at these nutrients, and you should consider doing something like Chronometer to track your intake and figure out ways that you could get these nutrients from food.
Yeah, no, such a good point. There was also a study that I think her name's Diana Rogers. She does a lot of stuff with like meat. I don't know if you know. Maybe her site used to be called like Sustainable Dish or something. But she's an RD. She posted a study like in the last few days, and I need to go in and look at it too. But similarly, was basically, I think they looked at 15 nutrients and like intakes of the nutrients, and found, again, not quite as high as your data, but 66% deficiency in calcium, 67% deficiency in vitamin E, and over 50% of the people were deficient in riboflavin. So, vitamin B2. So again, like, it is kind of wild, how much deficiency does exist. And I will say, like, in my patients, calcium's a huge one that's often deficient, like you said, because of dietary avoidance. Vitamin E's almost low on everybody. I mean, it's one that I struggle with too. And riboflavin, I do see it being low sometimes. So like those three in particular, I find fairly often are low with my patients. If you're eating a significant amount of like fruits and vegetables, you might be doing okay with potassium. But yeah, those three in particular, I think, are generally low across the board. And have, again, significant effects on the gut and overall body. But yeah, do you want to start with like calcium, or do you have anything else broad to say before we dive in?
I mean, they're all great nutrients. I think the only other thing I'm going to throw out there is, and I don't have the actual definition in front of me, but especially for vitamins, to receive the name vitamin, like, there are a lot of compounds in the body that are important, but we don't call them vitamins, right?
Right.
To get the label of a vitamin means that it is so important to human health and prevention of disease that we've like elevated it to this level of vitamin. And we know that if you don't consume enough of it, you are going to get disease because of that deficiency. So minerals are great and important too, but anything with the name vitamin in it should probably be super important and relevant to us if we want to lead a healthy life. And like we've been explaining here, deficiencies and insufficient intake are so common. And again, like I'm not convinced that taking a multi or a supplement is going to correct the issue. I think we're much better off trying to get these things from food. So I think that's the only other opener I wanted to start with.
The only other thing I will mention to piggyback off that is like, even if you want to get more granular about why these things are really critical for the gut, it's like we kind of know that most like gut issues, IBS, SIBO, are going to be related to gut-brain axis dysfunction. And what needs all the fuel and resources to function optimally? Your gut-brain axis. You can pretty much link any vitamin, mineral to some aspect of the gut-brain axis and why it's important for its function. So again, I think it bugs me that the gut-brain axis is such a big theme, but nutrition is rarely focused on as an intervention that's going to help with the gut brain, outside of like a few nutrients, maybe like
just
thiamine.
Gargle, Amy. Just be done with it. You dietitians and your vitamins and minerals, like shut up and just go gargle, man.
I know.
Golly, you're overcomplicating it, dietitian.
I know. I feel like in the book that I'm working on, I feel like I have a whole micronutrient part. And I feel like I'm just like, see, this is important for your gut-brain axis. It's like me saying, this is important for your gut-brain axis like 50 times in a row. And I'm like, oh, this seems excessive. Like maybe I should summarize this in a different way, but I like really want to pound it home.
Humans learn best with repetition.
Yes. Let's hope so.
Well, and I do the same thing. Like in FODMAP Freedom, module 1 is nutrition, but I keep it a little bit more surface level. And then module 6 is like, okay, now let's do a deep dive. And I talk about different vitamins and minerals, not even all of them, but like a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the whole time is me going, see, right. Niacin is important for your gut. Don't you care about it now? And then it's like, see, pantothenic acid is important for your gut. Don't you care about it now?
Right.
And I'm very transparent about that in the lectures and in the group Q&As. I pretty much joke about that with my students every time we hit that module is like, I'm just justifying why you need to care about these nutrients that you probably haven't cared about.
Right. And it's again, like I don't think there's honestly tons of money behind doing some of this research too. So like sometimes we almost have to like use theoreticals or just understand too that like we don't know how much magnesium's affecting the gut in its totality because it helps 300 different reactions in the body essentially. Like we don't know all to what extent that's gonna have in every aspect of digestion, but we do know certain things. And again, I think there's nutrients that we don't even understand the benefits that they have on the gut, and it's like you're much better off just getting the nutrients in. But yeah, I'm very passionate about this particular topic because again, it's kind of like a duh situation, but also no one's talking about it or emphasizing it or wants to pay attention to it. So,
well, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's not a lot of money in this, really. I mean, like, yeah, Thorne makes some money when you buy like methylfolate or whatever it might be, right? So there's some money in certain nutrients, but certainly there's no money to be had getting people to eat their nutrients through food.
Right.
And I don't know, it would be interesting to talk to somebody who has more experience with this, but I remember I read one time that like medical research funding is broken up into thirds. About 1/3 of research, like medical research, is funded by pharmaceutical companies, which obviously would have no interest in this. About 1/3 is publicly funded, so that would be like NIH, that kind of stuff. And 1/3 is funded by like private donors, like businesses or people who have an interest in a particular area of research. So when you think about the breakdown, really, I feel like the only way that we're going to get nutrition research in this regard is going to be like that public funding kind of stuff where there's really no bias or influence as to like who gets the funding money and who doesn't. I should say there's less or a different flavor of that going on versus, again, like the makers of Lipitor do not give a shit if riboflavin helps with cholesterol metabolism. They just don't.
Right.
And if anything, pharmaceutical companies might want to suppress this type of research from happening. And then private donors, it's probably going to be companies that are trying to research their product so that they can make money on said product. So like, remember a couple years ago when Microbiome Labs was telling everybody with a pair of ears that their probiotic heals leaky gut, and it was a study that they funded.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, really. I'm kind of digging a little bit at them, but not intrinsically. Stuff like that. Or I'm picturing like a wealthy person who had a loved one who passed away from breast cancer, and now they donate money specifically for breast cancer research, kind of a thing.
Right.
So I'm imagining that any hope of getting this stuff researched is going to come from like the publicly funded sector, which is only, at best a third of the research money that's available in the United States. So it's probably going to continue to be somewhat underfunded. But to your point, just because we don't have research on something yet doesn't mean that the link doesn't exist. It just means we haven't funded the research yet. So even if there is no direct study proving that like iodine is important for the microbiome, that doesn't mean that iodine is not important for the microbiome. And maybe you're just better off making sure that you're well nourished and like have a little bit of faith in that idea,
Yeah, totally. 100%.
Now, I will say at this point, I'm already sensing that this needs to be a two-parter.
Okay.
Because we have not even talked about a single nutrient yet. But I'm going to throw this out there so people are aware. You are ready to pop with the baby any moment, practically. And we are hoping that we're able to squeeze in one more episode of filming, that is, before baby Frankie decides to make her debut. So let's plan on doing a part 2 if the baby cooperates. And then we can have 2 of these episodes at the tail end of season 2. Yeah. And then we do want to do nutrient deep dive episodes in season 3 and really have a full episode on potassium, have a full episode on vitamin E, a full episode on riboflavin. So stay tuned for when that happens in 2025. But without further ado, I'm going to give the wheel to you. Amy, take the wheel. What nutrient should we lead off with? We're probably only going to have time for 3 in this episode. Yeah, I'm going to call it now.
I think calcium would be a good one. Just because, again, I think a lot of people avoid dairy in this space. And even some people that are eating dairy could be slightly low in calcium depending on their intake. But, I think that that's one of the 2 foods that usually gets removed. Sometimes people, when they go to a functional provider, it's like gluten and dairy is oftentimes one of the biggest foods that's removed. And some people do have lactose intolerance or bigger dairy intolerances. So again, I think it is important to sort of assess where you're at there, but it's very common that when I review someone's diet that it's deficient in calcium. So, and again, there's a lot of different effects gut-wise that can happen when you're not getting enough calcium. For instance, calcium, again, is important for stomach acidity. It's important for bile metabolism. So it has direct links to like digestive capacity. It's been shown to help with GLP-1, which again, Ozempic is all the rage. It helps with glucose uptake, glucose sensitivity. So that's really important. There's been some studies like gut-wise showing that it helps with lactobacilli growth. It seems to reduce like permeability. It's interesting that a lot of nutrients have been shown to reduce permeability and like leaky gut.
Maybe they're all important.
I know, exactly. Leaky gut. But yeah, and then again, like it's going to be important for smooth muscle and motility and things like that. So there's just a lot of different ways that calcium affects the gut directly. And again, of course, it's important for bone health. I mean, that's what we all
and that's why nobody cares about it, right?
Right.
It's like a
just the boring
reflex.
Bone. It's the boring bone.
Who cares
mineral.
about bones?
Right.
Yeah. And if I may interrupt you and add to that for a minute. So going back to Sarah Ballantyne's Nutrivore book, this was an area where I kind of had a mind blow moment. And I'm like laying in bed, casually reading this book, and I get to the part about calcium, and my brain automatically said, calcium, bones. I know what she's going to talk about. Nah. And then I got to it, and it's titled PMS as a Consequence of Calcium Insufficiency. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
What is this, Sarah Ballantyne? Tickle my whistle. And sure enough, that's my new term. I'm going to coin it, by the way.
Okay.
Sure enough, she had this great section in here. It's page 112, if you have the Nutrivore book, by the way. But she basically explains that there's it's too thick to get into right now, but basically there's a relationship between estrogen, calcium, parathyroid hormone, and serotonin. And serotonin is the important part here. But I'll read this little part. She says, you may recognize serotonin as the neurotransmitter important for mood regulation and whose deficiency is associated with both depression and anxiety. But as a hormone neurotransmitter, serotonin does so much more than boost our mood. Serotonin also influences learning and memory, body temperature regulation, sleep, sexual behavior, addiction, appetite, and pain perception.
Whoa.
IBS. Serotonin even helps to regulate intestinal peristalsis, which is why serotonin also plays a role in nausea, vomiting, constipation, and diarrhea. Yep, between those functions, all of the symptoms we associate with PMS are covered. And to me, I'm reading this and I'm like, IBS? And I don't know about you, Amy, but I've had a lot of female students and patients who report that their IBS symptoms or SIBO symptoms get notably worse at different points in their cycle.
Yeah.
Maybe this is why. And again, how many of those women are either avoiding dairy because of the lactose or avoiding dairy like I did for 10 years because they think they have a food sensitivity and their immune system can't tolerate that food. Right. So it really paints an interesting picture. But she talks about several clinical trials where they give women with PMS a calcium supplement, and within 3 months of taking that supplement, the PMS symptoms are reduced by like 50%.
Wow, that's wild.
And there was also studies with like people with, or women with the highest intake of calcium have the lowest incidence of PMS and vice versa. And women with the highest intake of dairy have lower incidence of PMS and vice versa. So it's really interesting. But again, it makes me laugh that even I, a couple months ago, right, like when I was reading this book, even I thought, she's just going to talk about bones. This is going to be boring. I'm going to skim it and then get on to a more exciting nutrient, right? But I have now started recommending increasing dietary calcium and sometimes supplementing with calcium to my female patients and students who have exacerbated GI symptoms at the last week or so of their cycle. And it's a little bit early to say if it's having an effect yet, because I haven't followed up with a few of the ones that I recommended this to, but I'm tentatively very excited, let alone knowing some of the stuff that you rattled off about calcium being important for stomach acidity and bile metabolism and, maybe the gut lining itself. That's really cool.
Yeah. And it's, again, the PMS thing's wild. And again, it just goes to show you sometimes we don't really understand the full context of what these nutrients are doing until we do like more research and things like that. But I think one thing I'll point out too, because this gets thrown in there by patients where they're like, well, I have IBS, so that's why I'm deficient in these nutrients, or like this idea that, oh, I'm low in nutrients because my gut's poor, is, again, not totally borne out in the research or, again, clinically very often. I think there can be really rare cases where, like, maybe like digestive insufficiency or absorption is majorly affecting nutrient status. But like, if you think about calcium, so calcium probably mainly affects the microbiome, like in some of the papers I was looking at, because it affects stomach acidity, because it affects bile, because it affects permeability. All those things create an environment where the microbiome can increase lactobacilli. Like, it creates an environment where your healthy microbes can thrive, and the microbes that aren't, especially like the sketchier microbes, as you will, tend to like decrease. So again, I think it's this idea too, sometimes with nutrition, that gets weird for people in the IBS space, is if they do feel like they're low or something, or even on testing, some of these like are harder to test for, but if they ever get a nutrient that's low, they might immediately assume like my iron's low because my gut's off.
Well, I have malabsorption,
right?
Like, how many people have been told erroneously that because they have a positive SIBO breath test, or because they have a leaky gut test, or candida, or whatever, that they're automatically diagnosed with malabsorption.
Right.
And it's really, it's sloppy is what it is. And it's like a lack of understanding. But, you know, to your point, calcium, you need stomach acid to digest calcium. And calcium is important for stomach acidity in return. Right. So it's kind of this like chicken or the egg situation. And then there's a lot of downstream consequences that can come from that, let alone the serotonin thing, let alone what, you know, the microbial piece of it. But yeah, I find a lot of people are deficient in calcium. It's probably one of the top nutrient deficiencies that I've seen clinically. And it's almost never because of malabsorption. It's because you're simply not eating the thing.
Right. And I will say too, with calcium, in terms of like, if you know you're low, like maybe you just like aren't eating dairy and haven't paid close attention to it, it can be a trickier one to get up if you're dairy free. I think there's definitely ways you could do it. I would be a little hesitant. Again, it's something I just recently had a conversation with a patient about, who is fairly lactose intolerant. So we were trying to kind of find different forms of dairy that maybe she would be able to tolerate that were lower lactose. So we're kind of still exploring that a little bit, because there seems to be some tolerance with certain foods at certain amounts. But things like almond milk, or like with supplemental calcium in them, a lot of the forms of calcium are not great in those products. So calcium carbonate's one that I see really frequently, which tends to not be a super well tolerated form of calcium.
Well, it's going to neutralize stomach acid, right?
Right. And it's basically an antacid.
Yeah.
Is essentially what it is. It's what's in Tums.
As a side note, by the way, my grandmother had osteoporosis, and I remember distinctly in like the late 90s and early 2000s, her doctor told her to take Tums every day as a calcium supplement.
Yeah.
And then at one point, when I first got into this world, my mom was doing that.
Yeah.
They have like these chewable, almost like taffy consistency Tums that are chocolate flavor. And my mom had them all over the house, and she was just popping them like candy because it's healthy for you.
Right.
And I had to have a talk with her and be like, no, Ma, this is not good. And I look back and I'm like, man, I wish that I could go back in time and talk to my grandmother when she was still alive, or talk to her caretakers when she was still alive. Because I wonder how much shit it fucked up. But that was, at least at the time, a pretty common recommendation, and it wouldn't surprise me if doctors are still recommending Tums as a calcium supplement to this day.
I remember in college when I had a little like reflux or something, we had Tums, and reading the package and seeing which says as a calcium supplement, use it in this way. So that is really, you're totally right. I think it is something that is done maybe even today. That was when I remember reading it. It was a long time ago. But yeah, I think the point being, though, is don't do that with the Tums. Also, a lot of the like milks and stuff, you can find some that aren't calcium carbonate, but a lot of them have really bad forms of calcium that might, not bad, suboptimal forms of calcium that are not really going to be absorbed super well and could lead to more GI distress.
And maybe that's more of a point to get whole food versions where you can. And again, if you even go on like the Nutrivore website and look up the info on calcium, I know she has a food list, for example. Another one that I've recommended, and I might have told you about this at some point, is oat straw. So not oatmeal, right? Like oatmeal is like the top part of that plant, and we harvest it and make oatmeal. The rest of the plant that the oats grow on, you could dry that and chop it up and make it into kind of like an herbal tea of sorts, and it's sold as oat straw. Oat straw apparently is a really good source of calcium. I have not tried to verify this claim. I'm going to say this now. I have not looked up on like PubMed or research or laboratory testing to confirm this, but at least according to the herbalists I have listened to, 1 cup of oat straw infusion is about 300 milligrams of calcium.
Oh, nice.
Which is pretty good. That's pretty hefty. So if you have like a cup or 2 a day, that could get you where you need to be. And it's not bad tasting. It's this is going to sound bad, but it kind of is vaguely reminiscent of hay, but not in a bad way. Like I grew up on a farm, so that's a good thing to me. But there's a website, it's nourishingherbalinfusions.com. And she only has a little bit of info on there. One of the tabs is for oat straw. And she walks you through like how, you know, what nutrients are in it and how to make this infusion. But basically I'll take a large, I think quart size mason jar. I'm holding up my hands like Amy knows.
That looks like a quart to me.
Okay. And the dietitian certifies this as true. So I'll get like 1 ounce of oat straw and then put it in the quart size mason jar and then fill it up with boiling water and then like put a plate or something on top, and I'll just walk away and leave it for like 3 or 4 hours. And then you strain it off, and that's how you would make this infusion. But that's a good dairy-free alternative that people could maybe consider. And it's cheap. It's real cheap.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think it's fun. To me, it's interesting. I used to go straight back in the day, like for some dietitians. And I remember I did like an article on calcium. And sometimes, again, it was kind of a bummer because that was back in the paleo space where there was like, oh, just have an almond. You know, it was like I'm like, I don't know if that's going to cut it. In reality, like almonds, like, sometimes the absorbability of the calcium is probably not going to be quite as good. Now, again, I think that it's a fine line, right? Because if you really are intolerant to dairy, you need to find other sources to get it dietarily. But I think my point being, I wouldn't just willy-nilly get rid of dairy because it's probably the easiest and best way to get calcium in the diet.
And that's basically what I did for 10 years. I just willy-nilly got rid of dairy. And you actually segued this perfectly for me. So thank you. I'm going to take the reins for a second here. So on the topic of ghostwriting, I distinctly remember this. And I actually looked up the article. I pulled it up on my computer right now. I remember, so I cut out dairy and gluten in like 2010. And then I remember it was like 2012, 2013, 2014, what I call the rise of paleo, when paleo was super popular. And I remember some people were telling me, like my mom was telling me, oh, you need to think about calcium. You need to get calcium. And I was like, whatever, man, it's fine.
Right.
And I remember I stumbled on this article on Chris Kresser's website that was written by a dietitian that you and I both know. And I'm not knocking her intrinsically, but this was kind of in keeping with the times. The article is titled, How to Keep Your Bones Healthy on a Paleo Diet. And I'm going to read you 2 pieces of this, and I'm going to talk about it for a second. Opening line. Contrary to what some nutritionists have claimed, a paleo diet isn't dangerous for your bones. Read on to learn yada, 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 yada. So they're already kind of like hooking you with the controversy. And then there's a section here. calcium is a surprisingly controversial nutrient. The government's guidelines, the government, automatically, like, you're calling to certain people with this, right?
Right.
The government's guidelines for calcium intake range from 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams daily for adults. But some experts suggest we only need about 600 to 800 milligrams of calcium. And then it goes on and on. So I just remember coming across this article, and it confirmed my existing bias and my existing belief. I knew at the time that dairy didn't agree with me, and I just wanted to keep eating that way. And I didn't want to put in the time or effort to find alternative calcium foods.
Right.
So, and I didn't want to bother with supplementing or anything. So I chose to believe, oh yeah, it's like the government lying to us, telling us we need to eat all of this calcium, and we really don't need that much. Maybe the RDA is incorrect. And this exact article gave me permission to ignore calcium for a full decade. And now I'm actually in a place in my life personally where I've realized this, and now I'm concerned. And now I'm actually intentionally eating more dairy and like more cheese and more whatever.
Right.
And I'm taking a little bit of a calcium supplement because I'm in a position where I'm trying to make up for lost time.
Right.
But I look at this article and cringe because, again, it called to my existing beliefs and biases, and it made it easy for me to just keep willy-nilly eliminating calcium from my diet. And I wish I never read this article, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. And again, I think that's always the hard part with the nutrition side of things, is like, it's all a bit like sensationalized and can hook you in or like affirm your already built bias. But yeah, I mean, again, with trying to get it in dietarily, like I said, I will do my damnedest to try to ensure that someone could maybe get dairy in. Now, again, there's certainly individuals I've worked with that can't, and we have to kind of work around that. And again, I think that that's okay. I'm not saying you're doomed, but like, it's still something I would definitely pay attention to, and potentially you might need to supplement if you just really can't get dairy in dietarily. Some other sources that are helpful are like bone and fish, can be a really good way. Now, again, I think it's not necessarily like someone's probably not going to eat bone and fish every single day, but like, it certainly could be a source that you work in like a couple times a week. Chris Masterjohn actually like at some point recommended like bone, like you can actually buy like bone meal or something from.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
I never did it. But I've had a few patients that have done it, and you can kind of mix it into things. But it'd be like more of a whole food option than like a traditional calcium supplement. So like that could be an option. There is like calcium in like some cruciferous veggies and things like that, but it's like little bits, it's not necessarily like big chunks like dairy could be. So again, I think my whole point here is that I think more people can have dairy in their diet than actually are eating dairy. And dairy is a very unique food group because I think it does provide the majority of the calcium in the American diet. And so it's really hard to kind of work around that, or it makes it more challenging than it might need to be if you can just work it back into your diet.
Yeah, well, it's almost like if you are not eating dairy, you do not have the luxury of forgetting about calcium.
Right.
Right? Like, you need to think about calcium more than a person who does consume dairy. And I had this conversation with a FODMAP Freedom student, or maybe it was a prospective student recently. And I basically posted as, you're allowed to be a plant-based eater. I'm not going to knock you for it.
Right.
But that means you don't have the luxury of forgetting about things like iron, B12, and zinc, and protein. And you're going to need, like, this dietary choice that you're making is going to necessitate a lot more thought and a lot more work to make sure that you're getting those 4 nutrients. If that's worth it to you, then that's fine. Like, go for it by all means. But if that's not worth it to you and you think that you could eat a plant-based diet and not focus on those nutrients, then I've got news for you. You're not going to do well.
Right.
And that's kind of the thing. It's like, it's like a priority pro-con kind of situation where you've got to weigh, what is it worth? Again, if somebody had an anaphylactic allergy to dairy, I absolutely would not encourage them to eat dairy. I would encourage them to do like oat straw and almond milk and these other things. So it's, but for me, I speak from personal experience. I avoided dairy for, actually, it was about 12 years, not 10, 12 years, Amy. And looking back at my situation and my history realistically, I currently hypothesize that I could have reintroduced dairy at least 5, if not 8 years earlier, had I not been hooked into nutrition dogma and food fear and beliefs about dairy being a bad food.
Yeah. Because the nutrition dogma around dairy, I think, is huge. Is it just being inherently inflammatory, which is not true.
Like gluten and sugar.
Right.
They're just evil. Nobody should eat them anyway.
Right. So, I think that the marketing campaign against dairy, especially in that like paleo era, I think was very intense. So I could totally see why you got hooked in. I was dairy free for like 2 or 3 years in that time too. And again, I think as much as we were like, oh, bones are boring too, bones are really important for longevity too. I mean, most of the people we're working with are more acutely concerned about their gut, which I get, but like you don't want to lose sight too that like you do want to have healthy bones as you age. And again, like you build bone through the age of like 30, and then you're just kind of trying to maintain bone as it kind of gradually breaks down as you age. So, and it's not, calcium isn't the only thing that's important for bone health.
It is a thing though.
It's a very important thing. So again, I don't think we want to necessarily overlook that completely as being like, oh, it's the boring bone nutrient, because that's super important across time. And adding again and making sure you're getting enough calcium is going to help protect your bones.
Yeah. And again, it's sort of this thing that we've talked about where people are so focused on the here and now that they lose sight of things in the distant future. And this is a well-researched thing. Like humans, and probably animals too, but humans generally don't do as well with like planning long-term. That's a skill that most of us don't naturally have, myself included. Like I would much rather eat the peanut butter cup versus like, I don't know, like you get the idea. Like we're more instant gratification creatures.
Right.
So it's genuinely challenging for our brains to think about what might be important to us when we get into our 80s. But again, I can tell you there were several things that came about in my journey adding dairy back in. Because again, I was very resistant to that idea for a really long time. But one of several factors that influenced that decision for me was when my mom spontaneously busted her ankle. No injury. She didn't fall. She was walking and her ankle just shattered. And then about 6 months later, she broke not one, but both of her wrists at the same time.
Oh my gosh. She
fell back, caught herself with her wrists, and she broke both wrists and needed emergency surgery on one. So, it's nothing like seeing your closest female relative and 50% of your genetic contribution, right? 50% of my genetic pool shattering multiple bones in the course of 6 months. And that was a bit of an initial wake-up call to me of like, ooh, maybe I should care about this. So yeah, bones are important. It's just, there was about 10 or 12 years of my life that I personally thought that was not super important to me because I was chasing other things.
Right.
If I can hit my table, if I can suggest this, because I think we have room for one more conversation here. In this episode that clearly needs to be a 10-parter, let's go ahead and stick with this theme of minerals, and let's talk a little bit about potassium if we can.
Yeah.
Potassium, again, like according to that one study in the Nutrivore book, is deficient almost universally. And I don't know if you remember this from school, if you could speak to this, because I only loosely remember this. Do I remember correctly that there is no official RDA for potassium? I think we use AI instead. There's something weird with potassium where like there's still a lot of debate how much we actually need. And if I remember correctly, I think even Chronometer uses adequate intake rather than RDA.
You might be right. Let me look it up. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Because I know I've seen some theorizing that the AI is probably too low and we need to be overshooting that metric quite a bit. Anyway, we're getting into nerdy nutrition stuff here, but what I want to bring up is I'm just going to read a little snippet, this time from the Nutrivore website, to wet our whistle. So she talks about how the balance between sodium and potassium is really important for cells to work, particularly like muscles and neurons and any cell that needs energy. And like sodium potassium pumps are really big for that. But she has this little section here to just paint a picture of why potassium is important. As a result of its role in membrane potential, potassium levels influence a wide variety of biochemical processes in the body, including vascular tone, hormone secretion, GI motility, blood pressure control, acid-base homeostasis, glucose metabolism, insulin metabolism, renal concentrating ability, electrolyte balance, fluid balance, and the action of mineralocorticoids, which are steroid hormones that the adrenals produce. So that list is pretty vast. And there's a couple of things that are like, okay, potassium influences glucose metabolism. And then blood sugar, sure as hell, affects your gut. Similarly, if potassium is affecting something like vascular tone or blood pressure control, blood flow, you need to get adequate blood flow to the brain and the gut if you want your gut to work. So there's a couple of things in here that will indirectly affect the gut, but also having an effect on GI motility is kind of a big deal for anybody listening to this podcast right now. So bloating, abdominal distension, abdominal pain, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, mixed bowel movements, SIBO, like if any of those things are relevant to you, you probably need to care about motility. And potassium is one of many nutrients that can affect motility.
Yeah. Well, I think even like, again, the fact that it's an electrolyte and it helps kind of balance fluids too certainly can play a role in like colonic motility too. It's going to pull more water into the intestines. So yeah, I think that's huge. And again, I think it's going to help pull water into cells as well. So it's like, it's one of those things where it's just, again, there's so many different areas that this could affect the gut, even the insulin sensitivity. It's like, in insulin metabolism and stuff like that, like anything that's going to affect blood sugar could certainly help the gut-brain axis. Like if you think about it just from that standpoint, it's like, okay, all these things could potentially affect the gut-brain axis. I think the one thing too, like the nerdier thing about potassium, like you were saying, like it's needed for a lot of the pumps. And again, like some of the pumps in the stomach that make stomach acid need potassium. So like gastric juices, stomach acid's going to need potassium. I was reading somewhere that I think there must be some potassium pumps for saliva production too. So again, like another digestive juice essentially is saliva. There was another study too that like lower potassium seemed to increase intestinal permeability. Again, you would be shocked how many nutrients affect intestinal permeability. It's like, I feel like almost all of them.
So if you're deficient in one of these nutrients, there's a higher likelihood that you have leaky gut.
Right.
Is the layperson translation of that. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I had two papers pulled up to to briefly talk about like how potassium directly influences the gut. So again, motility already mentioned. Right. There's one paper that I pulled up. It was a mouse model, but still it's something, titled "Low Potassium Disrupts Intestinal Barrier and Results in Bacterial Translocation."
Yeah.
So endotoxemia, the thing that a lot of people dread very much, like that's a big deal. Then there's another paper I pulled up, 2020, Associations of Sodium and Potassium Consumption with the Gut Microbiota and Host Metabolites in a Population-Based Study in Chinese Adults. And it's what we would expect: higher potassium and lower sodium, greater diversity of the gut microbiota. And then the converse was also true. So again, it really starts making you wonder how is IBS so prevalent, but it's actually the flip. It's like, how do more people not have IBS? Right. I know they say it's like 15 or 20% of the population. I'm wondering, how is it that anybody is functioning as well as they do, right, knowing that these nutrient deficiencies are so widespread and severe in some cases?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, like it almost comes back to something we've talked about, I know, in past podcasts, where it's like, oh, what's the weak link in your chain? And again, someone could still have permeability from some of these things, and it just doesn't manifest as gut symptoms. It manifests as metabolic disease and things like that. So yeah, it is really fascinating when you think about it in that way. And I think sometimes too, it's like you could be inadequately eating some of these things, but not necessarily to the point that some of these studies get to in a short period of time. So it could have been something that builds up over time. Like if you have just a subtle, maybe you're hitting 70% of your calcium needs on a regular basis, or like 70% of your potassium needs on a daily basis. Like maybe you can survive with that deficiency for a period of time and kind of function a little bit, but over time it could kind of start to wear and tear on your body in different ways. So I think there's a lot of that too, like that subclinical style deficiency where, there's definitely gaps, but it's not necessarily like an outright deficiency that you would see.
Again, like insufficiency versus deficiency kind of stuff, or like subclinical. Another factor too, and you almost alluded to it, but I don't know if it was intentional just now, which is keep in mind that what we're saying is not that like one group of people only have a calcium deficiency, and that a completely separate group of people have a potassium deficiency, and that a completely separate group of people has a riboflavin. I'm saying like most people are insufficient or deficient in numerous vitamins and minerals, and there's no way that we could study that, really, at least not that I'm aware of. That is really complicated to look at and try to evaluate. So Lord only knows how like calcium insufficiency plus potassium deficiency plus riboflavin deficiency plus MTHFR plus whatever is affecting you as an individual. And this is a part of why you're just better off making sure that you're getting as many nutrients as humanly possible through your diet. Like there's no way that they've ever studied your specific grouping of deficiencies, and they probably never will, for that matter, let alone like your deficiencies plus your genetics plus your stressors plus your microbiome plus your whatever. So you're just better off trying to nourish yourself as best as you can and crossing your fingers that you get it good enough. Right. I totally agree. Because I think some people don't believe it unless they see something that like perfectly mirrors their situation. Right? Like, oh, well, this group of people only had such and such, but I have such and such placebo plus this, and like, I'm different.
Well, and I think too, in most people's minds, unfortunately, they view the SIBO as the more acute situation that they need to address right away. And again, sometimes they think, oh, the SIBO is leading to more deficiency. So it's like, it's this urgency to address SIBO or these like really sexy topics. And in reality, like a lot of the nutrition related things could be leading to something like a SIBO or IBS situation. And it's like, you need to think about this in a totally different way and flip it on its head.
Or even maybe it's not causing the SIBO per se, but it's making it that much harder for you to recover from SIBO. That's still valuable too. Yeah,
you've done the same protocol basically 6 times and still aren't
and it keeps coming back.
Getting adequate support and having long-term relief. It's like, oh, you better try something different if you expect to get different results. But yeah, I agree. I think people don't really understand how to assess how many deficiencies you might have and how it's affecting them. I think people kind of underestimate the impact.
I'm excited. I just thought of the best metaphor possibly in this podcast. Are you ready? Ready. Okay. This one popped in my brain when you were talking about the quote that's attributed usually to Einstein of like, oh, doing the same thing but expecting different results is the definition of insanity. I was thinking about that layered with like inadequate fueling, and a car popped into my brain. And here's what I'll say. So in central New York, there's a place called Watkins Glen. The state park, beautiful, as a side note, totally go check it out. But Watkins Glen, the racetrack, at least when I was a kid, you could take your car to the racetrack and you could actually drive your car on that racetrack if you wanted. I don't know like how often they did that, but that was a thing. And, people would like haul ass in their like Buick or whatever. And it was funny. So anyway, I'm picturing if your body is like a vehicle and you put your vehicle on the racetrack and you're expecting to win this race against SIBO, but you're driving the same beat up jalopy that doesn't have any gas in the tank and you haven't gotten an oil change in like 57 years. And you're running this poor car over and over and over and over again, running the same race with the same beat up car with the same shitty fuel. And then you're shocked that you're coming in last place.
Right.
Maybe it's time to get a new car or at least take much better care of your existing car, right? Like maybe you could have one of the old classics and that's cool, but maybe like slap on some fresh paint, actually fill the gas tank with gasoline, get some new tires, maybe change the oil. Then run the race and see how you do. You might get 3rd place this time, or you might even win the race if you actually take care of the freaking car. But I feel like that's what people are doing. It's like they're running this beat up junker of a car and they're shocked that they're coming in dead last and that they're struggling so much. And, it's almost like we are in the grandstand watching this race. And to us, it's like, oh, duh. Of course you're not getting better. Of course you're not winning this race. Look at the car you're driving. How would you ever expect that car to perform under these circumstances?
Yeah, no, I love that metaphor.
But maybe you're in the car and you can't see how bad the outside of the car looks.
Well, I almost think too, you almost have to add in like some sort of layer of urgency, like someone yelling at you through the loudspeaker the whole time, like, you have to beat SIBO now. Or if you don't, the car is going to spontaneously combust. Or like there's, if only you could fuel up on this one supplement that's going to solve all your problems. Like I think that's the problem, is that the reason people get stuck on that track is because they're so stuck in like urgent short-term mindset. Which again, I get to an extent. You're uncomfortable. Like it's very hard to kind of like pull yourself back when you're in that state. I was in that state during my journey. But like nutrition is a long game. And so that's a really hard switch sometimes to make. It's like if you've been undernourished for a while, it can take a matter of months and stuff to get things back on track. And even before you look at micronutrients, if someone's still deficient in calories or their macros are all over the place, I'd rather them start there and then kind of get in the weeds with macros. So again, you might not even get into macros the first couple months, micros, like vitamins, minerals. You might not get that detailed until like a few months in to working with me. So again, I think that's just like a hard mindset switch. Not to say you couldn't be doing some things that might help symptomatically while you're working on nutrition. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with that. But I think the goal should be, the nourishment will help me IBS proof my body. And that will kind of lead me to the promised land much more than like a supplement will.
Yeah.
Versus the supplement being the promised land.
Well, again, I'm kind of picturing somebody coming along and like dumping a bottle of enzymes in the gas tank of this vehicle, or like squirting MCT oil in the gas tank instead of gasoline. Like, right. You don't want that old gasoline. That's old news. You want this. And it's like a marketing ploy. But yeah, I like the addition of somebody like screaming in your ear, you have to do this now. You have to win this race immediately. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
There's only one way that you should take this turn. Like getting real weird in the nitty gritty when you haven't focused on the basics.
Turn your wheel exactly 12.2 degrees. And hold it there for exactly 3.3 seconds. And then,
Right.
Yeah, just, I think that you all can figure out how to drive the car. It's just, you really need to put gas and oil and fresh tires on the car. And that's what vitamins and minerals are going to do for you. And again, and macros too. I'm glad you made that point. Don't even worry about this stuff. If you are eating actual garbage, or if you are like one of my students right now in FODMAP Freedom, she's starting off eating only 10 foods.
Right.
I don't care about her macros or her vitamins and minerals at all right now. I just want to help her introduce some new foods. Right. I almost don't care what foods she introduces at this point, because going from 10 to 11 is going to be a huge victory no matter what she eats. So like, if you're whittled down on this nothing burger diet, the name of the game is just to eat more. Once you have some degree of diversity in your diet, then, like you kind of mentioned, move on to calories and macros, carb, fiber, fat, and fiber. Then once you get through those things, this might be 6 or 12 months in. Now you might have the bandwidth to start thinking about things like calcium and potassium and vitamins and minerals. But it's a freaking journey, man. It's like you said, it's a long game, but it's going to pay you back with dividends, and you're going to finally win that race after all this time if you just listen to us.
Yeah. Listen to us.
Just listen to us.
That should be what we try to we're competing with the urgency voice. We're just saying, listen to us.
That's how we should sign off every episode. Just listen to us. But what I'm going to part ways with on this episode instead is a total turn. First of all, I'm going to say, let's do a part 2. I don't remember with our uploading schedule if it's going to post immediately after this one or if it's going to be one more in the future, but stay tuned. We'll do a part 2. But I wanted to leave you with a tidbit from my favorite comedian, Mitch Hedberg. Rest in peace. He passed away years ago. He had this bit, and I can't look at you because you're going to make me laugh, but I'm going to try to mimic the Mitch Hedberg delivery and the Mitch Hedberg voice because it was perfect. So he has this bit where he's like, I want to be a race car passenger, just the guy who bugs the driver. Hey man, can I turn on the radio? Why you keep going in circles? Man, you really like Tide. Can I hang my feet out the window? I love that imagery of Mitch Hedberg riding in the passenger seat of a NASCAR car and just saying all this dumb shit to the driver who's just like, shut up, shut up. He's like, why do we keep going in circles?
Oh my God.
So that is the best grand finale for an episode I can imagine. If you've never heard of Mitch Hedberg, go listen to him. He's hilarious. He has so many great one-liners. It is said that he would be the king of Twitter if he was alive to see Twitter. But we will catch you in the next episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast and part 2 to the underrated nutrients saga. Dun, dun, dun.